Hello and welcome to the third part of this video series in which I show you how I built this set of sci-fi buildings that can be used for various tabletop games like Star Wars Legion and Warhammer 40k. In the last two videos I already talked about how I built and detailed the buildings, and in this video I'm going to show you how I painted them to match both of my gaming mats. As I already explained in the first video, I gave all the buildings a coat of Mod Podge and then primed them with a cheap acrylic black paint. After that, I'm now going to prime the buildings again in a darker grey tone. Even though you could leave the black prime, I would highly recommend doing it, because if something from the first paint layer chips off or you miss a part with the second layer, you still have the black shining through and not some weird cardboard color. And as you already can see me do here, I'm mixing a lighter grey color to dry brush the buildings. So you want to take most of the paint off the paintbrush and then just lightly brush over so that only the texture and the raised areas grab onto the paint. I would recommend doing this with a few light passes instead of having one with too much paint on the brush, which messes everything up a bit. As for the grey I used, I just mixed the same black color I used as a primer and mixed in a little beige. This resulted in a pretty warm grey. If you want something different, maybe consider using white as a mixing color or even a light blue if you want it colder. To get a bit more variety into the grey paint and to save some time, I just took a light grey spray paint and misted it over the top of the buildings and a few of the raised areas. Similar with the dry brush, I just caught the details and the most raised edges to give them more light and to make them stand out a bit. And here you can see the result on the big building I did. And as a final step of this grey base coat, I'm going to do a final dry brush with a very light grey. And this is just to make the texture really stand out and make all the details we did before with the cardboard really visible. As with the spray paint, I really focused on the upper sides and the edges of the buildings. And at this stage I think the buildings already look pretty nice, so you could actually leave them at that if you want a really basic paint job. But as you can see here, I built these bunkers some time ago and I wanted to do a similar thing with these buildings. So I wanted to give them a bit of shading and also some weathering to make them really interesting and really unique. I think I went a bit heavy on this bunker, so I wanted to keep it a bit simpler than this. Before I got to the interesting stuff, I just picked out a few doors and panels with a light color and a few with darker colors. So most of these garage fronts got a coat of Deck 10 from Vallejo. After I did that, I picked out a few of the doors with Dragon of Nightshade, which is a blue shade paint from GW, which is like a very thin paint. Generally I opted for very desaturated paints, so everything kept that grey tone, even though I wanted a bit of color in it. And here you can see me doing a very tedious but yet very important step, I think. So I took a wash, which is just a very thin black paint. You can use a cheap acrylic or you can use something like a contrast paint from GW or shade paint from GW, which is a bit more expensive but works a bit better because it's very transparent. And I just brushed it into the recesses and on the edges of the buildings and then faded it out with a damp brush to accentuate the shadows of the buildings and the recesses, so the details would stick out a bit more and the shades were a bit darker, and it's just all in all makes the building look way more interesting and way more realistic. And it's also a good base for the weathering, so this will get enhanced a bit due to some rain marks and stuff like that, but generally this is a good starting point and you could also leave it like that. Here you can see what an effect this shading makes. On the upper one I didn't do it and on the lower one I already did it. So it makes quite a difference, even though it's not quite dry on this one yet, but yeah. And here you can see the darker panels I picked out on one of the buildings. I didn't texture these beforehand, so I thought it was a good opportunity to show some different materials and do some different colors on this building. As I'm showing you here, I used Abyssal Blue and Bearing Blue from Scale 75 to pick out most of the panels on the buildings. I use Scale 75 because it's a very matte paint and they have very nice desaturated tones that blend in really nicely with the grey of the building. And I specifically chose the blues because they contrast really nicely with my red magenta gaming mat and with the green gaming mat I have. So for this I would highly suggest just to take a look at your gaming board and your colors and just choose what looks nice for you and what you think looks good and fits the building and the style of your gaming mat. And you can already see me masking off some areas of the buildings here, and I did this because I wanted to have something like sector marks on the buildings, and I always thought it looked really interesting in movies when buildings had these painted marks on them, and I just wanted to replicate that. To avoid paint bleeding through the tape, which always could happen, especially with a highly textured surface, you don't want to thin the paint a lot, if any, and stipple the paint on so you don't get the brush underneath the tape. And it's always a good feeling to peel off the tape at the end and see that nothing really bled through. To place the markings, I just tried to match the general vibe of the building and tried to see where it would make sense to put these marks or where the building looked boring and needed something more. And then I just went around all the buildings, taped some off and painted some on, and yeah. So I think it looks pretty nice. You might not be a fan of this, so you don't really need to do it if you don't like it. But I really like it. I think it adds a lot of character to the buildings, and especially with the bright red and green gaming mats, I think makes the building stand out a bit more. And here you can also see the benefit of all these random cardboard stripes I glued on in the first video. Just picked out a few of them in this light blue, so it adds more interest, and also I don't need to decide where to put these stripes because they are already there and they look nice. And now you kind of reached another safety point where you just could leave the buildings like they are. I'm going to do some weathering on them now. For that I'm going to use enamel paints because they flow into the recesses really nicely and they blend really nicely on the surface. I'm going to start out really simple with an earth tone. I'm just going to put that all around the building on the bottom and fade it out towards the top, just to have like this dirt that got up onto the building. I'm also going to put this on top of the building and fade it out just to have some more interesting color variation on top and maybe some dirt settled on the top due to wind or some other irritations. You could actually use dry pigments for this, but I think you have a bit more control with the enamels. And yeah, here you can see me fade it out towards the top. With dry pigment this would be really natural to do. Like this it's a bit more difficult, but with all this texture it's quite easy to blend and the enamels fade in really nicely without blending a lot. And if you're going to replicate this, you will see that this is quite an easy process. You might be intimidated by enamel paints, but you really don't need to. They are really simple to work with, they're really cheap, and yeah, just don't breathe them in too much. They are not that nice to breathe in. And this step is really similar to the previous recess shading step. I'm just going to use dark wash, I think it's called. It's quite a dark brown enamel paint. You could also use a black enamel paint, but I'm only putting it towards the top recesses, so where rain would settle and run down to and leave stripes on the buildings. You can see me putting down some enamel paints on these parts and then taking a soft dry brush and just striping it down and taking the enamel out of the recess and striping it all over the surface in vertical lines. And again, this will dry quite soft, so this won't be a strong effect on the building, but it's in a way still very noticeable. So try not to overdo it, but also don't be too soft on it. And here with the wet paint and the glare of the light, you can see really nicely how I take it down and how I brush it all over the surface. To give the buildings that last bit of more interest, I'm using this enamel wash called Slimy Grime, which is a really nice green tone. It's mostly used for moss effects on tanks or buildings, and I'm just putting it mainly where I left a lot of this dark wash and in a few corners where it would make a bit of sense, and on top over the brown wash, just to simulate a bit of moss and a bit of wear and weathering. And here you can just leave a few blobs and then just fade the blobs out, and if your brown enamel is still wet, this will be pretty easy. You just have to pay attention that it doesn't flow too much into each other, but normally if the undercoat is a bit wet, it's really easy to blend it in. And as a last bit of interest, I'm adding this enamel wash called Rainy Marks, and this is white enamel, and I'm just using this last stage to give the buildings some stains, some more rain marks, some spots like bird poo on top, and the edges of the building I think look really interesting. So I'm not really doing a lot of this because too much is going to be weird, and I'm focusing it on the parts where I already put down the slimy grime because I think it looks really nice on the green. And that's it. That was the last step of the weathering, and the buildings are done now, at least for me. If you like to weather them more, use pigments or use some different techniques, you could always do that. I like them like this. They weren't too hard to paint and it didn't took too much time. And here you can see me setting up a few of the buildings on my forest gaming mat. I think the weathering looks really nice in this kind of environment with like this green forest ground in this humid environment, but I also think it's not too much to place the buildings in a more deserty environment or maybe a Xenos environment with like colorful floors and different materials, because it's not too natural and it's not too mossy and earthy. And here you can see me also add some Star Wars Legion barriers I painted a while ago with a few different color tones, but I thought they matched quite nicely, which made me really happy. And then the same thing on the magenta gaming mat. So here you can see that the weathering, even though it's more earthy and more realistic, still looks pretty nice on this more extraterrestrial alien ground. So that's it. And as always, if you have any questions or requests or comments, just leave them in the comments and let me know. I will try to get back to you. And if you like this kind of content, let me know so I know where I stand. And I hope you stick around for some new videos in the future. Goodbye.